On this episode of Business Interrupted,
you should be identifying some quick wins that you can take. There's parts of the organization that are more susceptible to disruption than others, or historically they may have been the reason why you got called in to start this program. So go there. Don't just do a blanket BIA. Start there and get that done. Get a plan done. Get an exercise done. And if you can do that in the first 6 weeks to the first month or two, man, that's an amazing victory that you got on base. And now you have a case example of an accomplishment. And that to me is far more important than trying to set up the perfect program.
business as usual is challenged every day. It's not about if disruption occurs, it's when. On this original show from Castellan Solutions, we're learning from the world's best leaders, so you can be ready for whatever comes next. I'm your host, Cheyene Marling. Imagine this. You've been brought in to fix a problem, but the existing business continuity plan is well past its expiration date. You're excited to do a refresh and create something new, but things don't move as quickly as you'd like. You're not getting traction with the stakeholders. The temptation is to try and hit the home run right out of the gate. But that could leave you stuck, waiting for everything to line up. For our guest, the key to success is to get on base and find those small, quick wins that will move things forward. Shane Mathew is a senior manager of business resilience at Zoom. Throughout his impressive career, he started and matured multiple programs that successfully reduced the impact of crises. In this episode, Shane joins me to discuss the keys to making your continuity program sticky. Along the way, he'll share the 3 most important things to consider when building up your organization's resilience. But first, let's get Shane's thoughts on the biggest mistakes he's seen people make when designing new programs. Take a listen.
I've worked at several companies. In one in particular, I was brought in because they had been, experiencing tremendous growth. They had a few disruptions, and so they came to the conclusion with some outside help, some consulting help recommended, build a business continuity program. And the way the organization was built, they did not have that expertise in-house. So they hired me to come on board and start this program. And this organization had, customer support type of activities. They had pharmacy operations. They had dispensing activities. So there was a gambit of work to be done. So this was like a really cool challenge for me in that it wasn't just one type of, it wasn't just one product that was going out the door. There was multiple aspects to what we were doing. I started to build a program. I got a software tool. I started designing a BIA. I did the interviews. I got some consulting help to help me because it was a team of one. So I basically did everything that you would imagine is in the traditional roadmap of a business continuity program starting out, right? And I was checking the boxes, going down the list. I got to get this, got to get that, and so the unfortunate problem is that the business, as the business was also growing, there was some headwinds that hit the company, and so much so that leadership, especially the leadership that brought me in, began to see turnover. And then my direct leader who hired me, ended up going to a different organization. So now, there was some layoffs and there was some reorgs, and now my role, which was once kind of top of mind amongst executive team and this activity was, the events, the disruptions I referred to, which occurred, maybe a year and a half before, now they're becoming a distant memory. And so, eventually my role got moved around, and I had to take on responsibilities that are nowhere near my job description. I was working on projects, again, to help the business, but nothing related to business continuity. And so much so that eventually I was like, this is not going to work out in the long run for me. And so I decided to move on. Now, I brought this story to bear because this was the situation. This was the point in my career where, prior to that, building a BC program was pretty much standard, check the box, run down the list, get it done, and knock it out, right? But it started to make me realize, I was like, how many legacy business continuity programs are there in the world? I was like, how many programs have been around for 10 to 15 years, right? And as I was growing in my experience, I realized there's not many. In fact, I would say BC programs are kind of like a banana. There's a shelf life before it's rotten and it needs to be thrown away or redone, or you buy a new banana. Okay, I know this is it's a weird example, but for me, it made sense. Is that there's a shelf life for these programs, and there's a lot of levers that if they're not pulled, if they're not done correctly, you could quickly see, your program's thrown out with the trash the next day, and you're just caught off guard. So I think that was like the most impactful to me, because from that point forward, I started to really design programs and think about designing programs that were going to stand the test of time. So I think that's where I would say it was the most impactful moment in my career, was really kind of have to fail pretty hard and move from there.
Going through that process, what advice would you give to someone else who's had to encounter that? Or even someone that's new to the industry, not even knowing that could happen?
I think the number one takeaway has been that, again, there's no such thing. Well, there's very few legacy programs, right? So if you think you're going to come in and do something dramatically, you're going to do something different, you have to kind of check yourself and assume that somebody's already done what you're planning to do. Again, if you follow, traditional BCM techniques, there is a lot of similarity, and people have done it, right? That's one thing. So I've kind of come up with a couple of lessons I've been applying at programs, especially when I was working in consulting. I was learning, from these various clients. Many of them had programs in the past, like you said, Cheyenne. They died off, they're restarted, and so I kind of came up with this term in my head. I call it the resilience program reboot cycle, right? So there's always like a continuum of activity that happens, and as you described it, there may be gaps of weeks, months, years in some cases, and then an emergency happens, or a regulatory body says you got to do it, and then all of a sudden it starts back up again, right? So there's a couple of rules I follow, but the one I take away the most is, when you're starting a BCM program, I have to use a baseball analogy here, but don't wait for the perfect pitch, okay? Just get on base. So when I say that, what I mean is, a lot of times as professionals, and I did this, right, when you're building the initial program, you're trying to get all the tools ready and set up, and you're trying to complete everything in the order of operations that we have been taught from the first time we entered, a certification course or a presentation on this, which is, get your software tool up and running. If you need one, get one up and running. Even if you don't need one, people are buying software tools just to build it, right? So I like to look at it as a timeline. Okay, the day you got hired, you have a few weeks of getting to know the organization. You might start building out your tool sets and identifying where you're going to do your BIA. You build your BIA tool. You get your first BIA started. You eventually get all the business done of BIAs. And depending on how big your organization, but that could be months or weeks. Sometimes I've heard of some organizations take like a year to just run through and do every single work unit. And that's even before you actually build plans, right? So you get through the BIA, then you start building plans. So that runway is so long that it's just like, by the time you produce some tangible result, it's so far past when you started. So that was one of my biggest takeaways, is like, you got to win fast. So don't worry about everything being perfect. Don't try to make sure that you get every single BIA done before you move to the next phase. So one of the things I do now is I really focus on, hey, if we need to do some of the regulatory requirements, like build a standard or a document, a policy, yeah, do that, right? But in parallel, you should be identifying some quick wins that you can take. And generally, the way I look at it is like there's parts of the organization that are more susceptible to disruption than others, or historically, they may have been the reason why you got called in to start this program. So go there. Don't just do a blanket BIA. Start there and get that done. Get a plan done. Get an exercise done. And if you can do that in the first 6 weeks to the first month or two, man, that's an amazing victory that you got on base, and now you have a case example of an accomplishment. And that to me is far more important than trying to set up the perfect program, which I think we tend to do. And while it's a great ideal, it's just not feasible when you think about that reboot cycle. Just remember the clock starts on day one, and each day that passes is one day further away from the historical event that started your career there, or the regulation, or the consulting recommendation. It's just more and more days pile up, and people's memories are real short. So don't try to hit home runs in the first inning. I think it can be as simple as a plan, a tabletop. I mean, and oftentimes I tend to start out programs with tabletops because you can easily demonstrate the value of this type of planning when you put these scenarios in front of people's eyes. But then also it's something to at least get a baseline and start moving forward. So that's like a big one for me. There was two other ones. One was making business continuity fun, and I know that's kind of a weird way to say it, because some of you may, listening may think, "Oh, well, of course I make business continuity fun," but or you may be thinking, how can you do that? So, I mean, because it's traditionally like risk management, right? It can be dry. People don't want to think about risk. So when you show up and you say, "Hey, we're going to do a hour or 2 hour long interview, or you're going to fill out this questionnaire online," people are just, they don't want to do it, right? So I saw that in one role when I came to them for the second BIA. Okay, we did the first one, and I came back the next year, and they like groaned. I was like, I don't want to ever hear that again. When they say Shane coming, they should be interested at the minimum, if not like, okay, cool, it's time for us to go through some tabletops again. Like that's the engagement. So how I do BC making it fun, well, a couple of ways. One is that I try to incorporate games, right? And I've talked about this in presentations and on my podcast before. Is like gamification is so impressively important. It can draw people in so quickly. We built this one game for risk identification where we built a battleship board and basically we created little ships representing different product lines, and for each product line there was you put little pegs in the ship and that it sunk, right? But in our case the pegs were like technology, personnel, applications or facilities, and those dependencies were mapped on these little ships. So some product lines required all of those things, and other product lines maybe just required one or two, right? So then we started playing this game. You roll the dice, so when we talk about that with this group context, people started to engage far more than if I just said, "Hey, let's start listing out your risk points," right? So, that type of gaming, or doing it in a workshop setting where you're collecting data with similar groups, it really, like we play this one game called Attackers and Defenders, where basically you put two groups in the party and say, your job is to bring down the company's product line, and the other team their job is to defend the company's product line. So they're supposed to come up with ways to destroy or break or bring down that activity, and while the other team is coming up with defense, right? So again, just another competitive way to engage these audiences. And one, in fact, I had one with that game I described with the battleship. And I literally had our facilities director come up to me a few weeks later and it's like, "Hey, when are we going to play that game again?" So I thought that was like a very defining moment for me, because I don't think I've ever had anybody come up to me and say, "Hey, when are we going to do BC activities anymore, Shane? I'm excited for the next one." So there's all sorts of techniques out there, but it's important for you to adopt that mentality that I don't want people to think this is boring. This has a need, because I guarantee you, if you get to that point in your leadership's decision making where they're saying, should we keep business continuity or not? The good feelings are what are going to keep your program. I mean, I know it sounds really superficial, but oftentimes it can come down to that. Yeah, there's some value in this program, and that's based on their experience in the program.
And I think you said you had a third one too, right?
Yeah, we tend to think about big mitigation strategies, or we're going to move our whole facility or build a backup site somewhere. And I found that in that example in my career where things really went well was when I was finding simple fixes. And I've used this term before in other contexts, the risk nugget. Okay. So basically, I define that as you're uncovering big picture risks, or doing BIAs, you find little pieces, little simple fixes that can really go a long way, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. I'll give you an example. We had a production environment with a manufacturing belt, and 15,000 orders would go out a day, right? So you can understand that if that conveyor belt system went down, that we would have immense problems getting orders out the door, right? By cutoffs of mail and all that sort of stuff. So when we were doing some digging about this, we were talking about this topic. Oh, the conveyor belt goes down as the risk. Well, we started to dig deeper and found out that our maintenance contract involved a 4-hour turnaround. The maintenance man we had on contract was based in another state and would have to drive there. And then we were like, well, what's the most likely problems that they've had to fix? And they're like, an air compressor. Well, can we just buy an air compressor and put it over here and just connect it if we have to, like replace it right away? I mean, it was like an $800 investment at that time, but it was an amazing solution. We didn't have to think about, well, how are we going to reprogram all our orders to go to our other site? How are we going to make sure personnel are there to handle the extra workload? All those mitigations could stop just simply by saying, hey, let's have a strategy around replacing this one piece of equipment. And so, again, simple fixes, right? We didn't have to go to executive management and say, I need a whole new facility ready to go, or I need to add personnel costs for elongating our hours and overtime. The reality is 30-minute downtime, I got a plug and play air compressor. That's going to fix everything for $800. That sort of solution was going to be approved all day, every day. And so that's what I'm saying. We tend to think we need the big solutions. And in fact, if you do a little digging, you can oftentimes find it's small little things like this that can really go a long way.
So, in using these three kind of three things, right? How do you go above and beyond to really make it sticky? Like, what does sticky mean to you when you think about business continuity resiliency planning? What does that mean? And how do you try to capture that approach or keep the program sticky in addition to these three things?
The way I look at stickiness is, if Shane is not there, does this continue in the same way? Is the vision that I bring, or the vision I work on with my team together, sufficient enough and bought off by our immediate team that it continues long after I move? Because people come and go, right? So I think that's a key thing, is that it cannot be just let's follow a cookie cutter approach and just hope that all these other pieces fall into play. I mean, I see myself not only as doing the work of business continuity when I'm on a team, but also really evangelizing this concept around the organization. And that does take time depending on the organization, right? Some organizations, they're really ripe and ready for that sort of getting it embedded in different areas. And that's, I think, the stickiness also will depend on how much you get the investment from team members across the org. One concept I try to use is the centers of resiliency, where you identify points in the company that are really homogeneous around their resiliency, like your customer support entities, or if you're in a manufacturing, all the production areas. These are kind of similarly located areas where if you can get their leaders to not only understand the concept but accept ownership of it, that is ultimately the key. A friend of mine, Scott Baldwin, you may have heard of or talked to. He's at Netflix right now. Ball and I have these discussions, and he kind of gave me these contexts, and I've used them now, which is basically, put the ownership on business units, right? So in my standards that I write, I make sure that the department leader is the one responsible for their BC program, not me. Because even if I leave or this program goes away, that department owner still needs to be responsible for ensuring business resiliency or business continuity practices are taking place. So I think, again, ownership is one thing. It can't just be about you as a program leader. You have to develop your systems, your programs, your activities with the sight that if you're not here, would this continue on? Would this activity further without your help? And I think that's the way to look at it if you want to maintain or ensure stickiness.
I love it. And your approach, your methodology, I think is incredible. Now, I'm talking to another podcaster because you also have your own podcast as well, the Fail Over Plan podcast. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I started in July of 2020 because I was bored out of my mind. So I thought, let me use some of the skills I have in media and try to build something else. And the show's Failover because, again, like I mentioned, my time in that one organization where if you look at it holistically, externally, you could say, well, man, Shane failed. And I agree with that. I agree. I don't think the program really lasted the test of time. And so from that experience, it really built a lot of who I am today. And so that podcast that I've designed, and I'm going to start, I've taken a little break and I'm going to start back up again. But the point is that podcast is focuses on finding those leaders who have went through the same thing. What did they learn from failures that could really be applicable and helpful to the BC practitioners of today?
Excellent. So tell me, if any of our listeners want to reach out to you, how can they find you? How can they reach out to you?
Absolutely. I welcome anyone on LinkedIn to communicate with me. I'm pretty active there. I love talking to individuals, especially if you've learned lessons that you want to share with me. I would absolutely love to hear from you. So yeah, LinkedIn is the best way to get a hold of me.
Thanks for listening to Business Interrupted. I'm Cheyene Marling for this Leaders episode. To get more insights and resources, check out the show notes or head over to castellanbc.com and follow along wherever you get your audio.